In the annual meeting last week, we had a little exercise that was given at the back of the packet that everybody received, and then if you didn't have that with you, there were other ways of doing it. Well, anyway, we were asked to chart where we thought we were as a parish, whether we were at a point where we were still growing, or if we were beginning to decline, or whatever, the gradations were in between. And you can see the results so far on the chart that's still in the Memorial Hall, of how the majority of the people who responded, where they landed in the progression. And only a couple of people thought that we were, getting near the end of our life, that we were either declining or we were into the period of disintegration. And as I thought about that and the scripture for today, and in particular having read a reflection or two on the first reading today from the prophet Micah, I thought all of that's very important, but there's probably one other thing that we need to keep in mind in the midst of all of that examination and trying to chart a course for the future of the parish. And that is what we really are being called to be. Are we being called to be great, or are we being called to be good? And even though in our American culture, and not so many years ago, this book that came out that said, that good was the enemy of great, and how many companies, it was an examination of 11 businesses in the United States, companies that were great and not just good. The point that we find ourselves in, we have to decide whether we want to be good or are we trying to be great. Micah, towards the end of the reading today, gives those kind of three things that he says that God requires: that we do justice, that we love kindness, and that we walk humbly with God. That any Christian, any follower, needs to do those three things: do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. And it goes along really well with what Jesus says in the Beatitudes today in the Gospel, of the kind of life that a disciple of Jesus Christ should live. It's all reflected in the Beatitudes, but maybe Micah sums it up a little better. And that if that's where we concentrate our attention, we will become truly good. We don't have to worry about being great, because great many times is a false value. Even some of those companies that were identified as great have fallen now into the good to not so good category. Because, as Mother Teresa once said when she was, asked about how all the work she was doing wasn't making a dent in the society around her, she said, God doesn't call us to be successful. He calls us to be faithful. And what Micah was doing back in the 8th century BC, at the time that also Isaiah and Hosea and Amos are doing their ministries, is to call the people to the awareness of what God really requires. What does God really want you to do? How does God really want you to be? Because there was plenty of injustice. And there was this lack, not only a lack of civility, but real just meanness and division all over the place. And there was a sense of arrogance because God was their God, and that was the way it was, and so, well, why worry about it? As though God owed it to his people to be there for them. As though it were God's responsibility to do everything. And so, what Micah calls them to, what the Beatitudes try to impart, what St. Paul basically gets at today in that second lesson, is how you and I, as disciples of Jesus Christ, need to be living this life of ours. What the real values are, what we as individuals and as a parish community really ought to be doing, how we ought to be living. You know, with all that's happening around us in the political sphere, wherever we may be, however we might feel or think about what's happening, one of the things we have to remember is that as disciples of Jesus Christ, we don't always have to agree with what's going on society-wise. We also don't have to fall into the trap of thinking that if we don't somehow explode numbers-wise, that somehow we are failing. What we have to do is continue to do justice. In other words, those ways that we already promote justice through our parish, justice in the sense of trying to remain involved in the community at large, doing what we can to serve others, to make ourselves aware when something needs to be addressed, whether it's the issues of people ready to become homeless, or people who are hungry in our community, or whether there's a particular group that's being singled out as, you know, I don't know if our Muslim tenants downstairs, the Islamic community of Batavia, I don't know if they're being singled out by anybody right now, but it wouldn't surprise me. But how we regard them, regardless of what we might think about others in other places who have done horrible things. But we are called to do justice. We're called to be aware. We are called to be people that give and to serve and to care, and that's what makes us truly good. Nobody has to look at us and say that, oh boy, those people are really great over there. They just need to recognize Christ alive in the things that we do. And then, do love kindness. How difficult is it for us to be kind to one another? You know, the kindness that we show is not just some, patronizing kind of thing, but a real loving interest. After all, in the early church, what attracted people to Christianity wasn't the size, because it was a minuscule group. But what attracted people was the kindness, the genuine love and affection that people in the community had for one another, that people in Roman society and elsewhere did not experience. It was the way they loved one another that attracted people to that Christian way, and how they would love those who were unlovable, as they would be faithful to the Lord who loved this humanity of ours that's plenty unlovable. how the Christians went about loving the unlovable, and how even today that's done in Christ's name in many places. And we, of course, help to facilitate that by what we give and how we're involved. But that's another one of the things that if we carry it out with God's help and grace, we become good. We don't have to try to come up to somebody's definition of great. And then to walk humbly with God. Sometimes we might find ourselves in the position of giving God advice about how He ought to treat us, or how we ought to run things in the world. We're called to walk humbly with God. And humility, or meekness, if you will, that we hear about in the Beatitudes, is not an attitude of being a doormat. It's not an attitude of sort of saying, oh, well, you know, if you really want to, you know, shrinking down as if, you know, we had nothing to say and nothing to give and we're nobodies. But walking humbly with God means to acknowledge who I am, who God has made me to be, and what it is that God has called me to do, and how God has called me to live in this life that He has given me. And that I live it. I live out my vocation as Christian, as a married person, in my case as priest, and in your cases as the baptized believers, all of us together as the baptized believers. And what we put our money to, what we say about other people, what we support, what we oppose, all of those things. But who we are, admitting humbly to God, and sorry for the repetition there, but to admit to God who I am, which is saying, thank you for making me as I am. Help me to become what you fully want me to be. And acknowledging who God is. That He's the Lord. That He has a right to my obedience, a right to my worship, because of who God is. A right to obedience from me. And I think, truly, taking into account all kinds of things that we honestly have to look at and do, that if we can be seen by others as doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly with God, if people see that, that will bring them to this place. That will bring them to a different relationship with God, and perhaps for the first time. Nothing comes easily, especially when we are looking at our own lives and realizing that there may be some things that have to change in us. Change is always difficult when it has to do with individual attitudes, ideas, patterns, habits, etc. But God would not call us to a fuller life. Jesus would not have died on the cross and been raised from the dead, would not have shared that life with you and me through baptism, if change weren't possible. God would have left us to wallow in our own misery, but God didn't do that. Because God knows what we are made of. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And He calls us to that awareness that His grace can achieve in us if we but say yes. And we are invited again today in this celebration of the Eucharist, where we remember Christ's death on the cross and his resurrection and our share in it, and where we are nourished by the gift of his very self, so that we can more fully live in that way that is pleasing to God, in that way that gives life to the world around us, in that way that gives God true glory, because we are becoming more fully alive in his grace. So let's, all of us today, take a moment or two when we are alone to ask the Lord how we can better do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with him, so that we can become truly the good sign, the faithful sign of his love and response to it in our part of this world that God has given to us to cultivate in his name.